Somewhere in the humid darkness of Caracas, Venezuela, a small team of operators moved like ghosts through the urban sprawl. They carried no identification. Their weapons bore no serial numbers traceable to any military on Earth. Their faces would never appear on any news broadcast. Their names would never be declassified in our lifetimes, and if captured, the United States government would deny their very existence. These were the operators of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, known to the world simply as Delta Force. And tonight they were executing what many had considered impossible, the extraction and arrest of one of the most protected and paranoid dictators in the Western Hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro had spent years insulating himself from exactly this moment. He surrounded himself with layers of security that would make a medieval king envious. Cuban intelligence advisors, Russian mercenaries, Venezuelan military loyalists whose careers and lives depended entirely on his survival. He slept in different locations every night. He traveled in armored convoys designed to survive rocket attacks. He had survived coup attempts, assassination plots, and international sanctions that should have crippled his regime years ago. And yet here, in the suffocating tropical night, America's most elite warriors were about to prove that no fortress is truly impenetrable. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, how a team of roughly 24 Americans came to be stalking through the streets of a hostile foreign capital with orders to apprehend a sitting head of state, we need to go back, way back. We need to understand not just the politics and the planning, but the extraordinary unit that made such an audacious operation even conceivable. We need to understand Delta Force. The story of Delta Force doesn't begin in some high-tech command center or a Pentagon briefing room. It begins in the jungles of Vietnam, in the mind of a Green Beret colonel who was becoming increasingly frustrated with what he saw as fundamental weaknesses in American special operations capabilities. His name was Charles Alvin Beckwith, and everyone called him Chargin' Charlie. Beckwith was the kind of soldier that Hollywood struggles to portray accurately because he seems too extreme to be real. He was profane, aggressive, and absolutely brilliant at unconventional warfare. He had served an exchange tour with the British Special Air Service, the legendary SAS, and that experience had fundamentally changed how he thought about special operations. The SAS operated with a level of surgical precision, individual skill, and selective recruitment that simply didn't exist in the American military of that era. When Beckwith returned from his time with the British, he carried with him a burning conviction that the United States desperately needed a similar capability. This wasn't just professional admiration. Beckwith recognized that the Cold War landscape was shifting, that the emerging threats of international terrorism and hostage situations would require operators who could do things that conventional forces simply couldn't. Small unit direct action, surgical strikes. The ability to put a handful of impossibly skilled men into the worst situations on Earth and trust them to figure it out. For nearly a decade, Beckwith fought the bureaucracy. He submitted proposals. He lobbied generals. He argued with Pentagon officials who couldn't understand why existing special operations units weren't sufficient. Time and again, his vision was rejected, shelved, or ignored. The Army establishment viewed special operations as something of a sideshow, necessary perhaps for certain niche missions, but hardly worthy of the kind of investment Beckwith was demanding. Then came the wake-up call that changed everything. In 1972, Palestinian terrorists massacred Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. The whole world watched in horror as the hostage situation deteriorated into a bloodbath that claimed the lives of 11 Israeli team members, 1 German police officer, and 5 of the 8 attackers. The West German authorities, unprepared for such a sophisticated terrorist operation, had botched the rescue attempt catastrophically. Munich demonstrated in the most visceral way possible that modern terrorism had evolved beyond what conventional police or military forces could handle. These weren't bank robbers or political dissidents. These were ideologically driven fighters who were willing, even eager, to die for their cause and who had proven themselves capable of sophisticated, coordinated operations that could paralyze an entire nation's response. 3 years later, in 1977, a team of Palestinian and German terrorists hijacked Lufthansa Flight 181 and ultimately landed in Mogadishu, Somalia. This time, however, the outcome was different. The German GSG-9 counterterrorism unit, created specifically in response to the Munich disaster, stormed the aircraft and rescued all hostages while killing 3 of the 4 hijackers. The operation demonstrated that with proper training, equipment, and operational doctrine, terrorists could be defeated even in seemingly impossible hostage rescue scenarios. America watched both events with intense interest, and for Charlie Beckwith, they provided exactly the ammunition he needed. He found an ally in General Edward Meyer, who would eventually become Army Chief of Staff, and together they finally pushed the proposal through the Pentagon's resistance. On November 19, 1977, Delta Force was officially activated at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Beckwith's decade-long dream had finally become reality, but creating a unit on paper and actually building one capable of the missions Beckwith envisioned were two very different things. From the beginning, Delta Force would operate under a philosophy of extreme selectivity. Beckwith understood that the effectiveness of the unit would depend entirely on the quality of the individual operators, so he designed a selection process that would become legendary for its brutality. Candidates, typically drawn from the Special Forces and Ranger communities, would face a month-long assessment that was designed not just to test physical endurance, but to evaluate psychological resilience, problem-solving ability, and that intangible quality that separates the exceptional from the merely excellent. The course included long-distance land navigation with heavy rucksacks across the unforgiving terrain of the Appalachian Mountains. Candidates would be given coordinates and time limits, and no further information. They wouldn't know how far they had to travel or how fast they needed to move. This deliberate ambiguity was designed to break those who needed external validation or clear expectations to function. The psychological evaluations were equally rigorous. Candidates sat before boards of psychologists and veteran operators who probed every aspect of their personality, searching for the specific combination of confidence, humility, intelligence, and adaptability that Delta Force required. The unit wasn't looking for mindless action heroes. They wanted thinking warriors, men who could operate with minimal guidance in incredibly complex and morally ambiguous situations. The attrition rate was staggering. In many selection classes, fewer than 10% of candidates made it through. Some of the most decorated soldiers in the Army, veterans of elite units with combat records that would make most men's careers, washed out in the first week. This wasn't failure in the traditional sense. It was simply recognition that Delta Force required something that couldn't be taught, something that either existed within a person or didn't. Those who survived selection entered an intensive training program that would last for months. They learned close quarters battle techniques, shooting until they could put rounds through targets with the kind of precision that defied normal human ability. They trained in explosive entry, rapidly breaching doors and walls to gain access to hostage locations. They learned advanced driving and surveillance techniques, how to operate undercover in hostile environments, how to assume false identities and maintain them under pressure. But perhaps most importantly, they developed the operational flexibility that would become Delta's defining characteristic. Unlike conventional military units that operated according to rigid hierarchies and detailed operational orders, Delta Force operators were trained to think on their feet, to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, to make life or death decisions without waiting for orders from above. This required a level of trust between operators and command that was unusual in military organizations, and it produced a unit that was frighteningly effective. Delta Force remained classified for its first few years of existence, its operators training in relative obscurity while the unit developed its capabilities and doctrine. But that obscurity would end dramatically and tragically with the unit's first major operation. On November 4, 1979, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 66 American citizens hostage. The hostage crisis would consume the final year of the Carter presidency, and it would fall to Delta Force to attempt what seemed impossible, a rescue mission deep inside a hostile country against captors who had every advantage of terrain, numbers, and information. The plan, codenamed Operation Eagle Claw, was ambitious and extraordinarily complex. 8 helicopters would launch from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz and fly low across the Iranian desert to a staging area called Desert 1. There, they would rendezvous with transport aircraft carrying the Delta Force assault team and additional fuel. After refueling, the helicopters would carry the operators to a hidden location near Tehran, where they would hide through the following day. The next night, agents inside Iran would provide trucks to transport the team into the city, where they would storm the embassy compound, neutralize the guards, and extract the hostages to a nearby stadium. Helicopters would then fly everyone to an airfield seized by Army Rangers, where transport aircraft would carry the Americans to safety. It was an audacious plan, and it very nearly worked. But on the night of April 24, 1980, everything went wrong. Dust storms plagued the helicopter formation from the beginning. One helicopter suffered a critical navigation failure and had to turn back. Another experienced a hydraulic problem and was abandoned in the desert. When the remaining 6 helicopters finally reached Desert 1, a third discovered a crack in its rotor blade that made it unflyable. The mission now lacked the minimum number of helicopters required, and the on-ground commander made the agonizing decision to abort. What happened next transformed a failed mission into a catastrophe. During the withdrawal, one of the helicopters collided with a transport aircraft. Both aircraft erupted in flames, killing 8 American servicemen, 5 Air Force crew members, and 3 Marines. Delta Force operators watched helplessly as their comrades burned. They had to leave the bodies behind along with the destroyed aircraft. The aftermath of Eagle Claw was devastating. The mission's failure was broadcast around the world, seeming to confirm perceptions of American weakness and ineptitude. The Carter presidency never recovered, and for Delta Force, the first real test of the unit's capabilities had ended not in triumph, but in tragedy. But Beckwith and his operators knew something that the public didn't. The failure of Eagle Claw had nothing to do with their ability. The problems were logistical and mechanical, failures of equipment and planning rather than execution. Delta Force operators had performed exactly as trained. They had simply never been given the chance to demonstrate what they could do. In the years that followed, Delta Force would get many more chances, though the details of most operations would remain classified for decades. The unit was reorganized and expanded. Lessons from Eagle Claw led to the creation of better command structures and more reliable equipment. Training became even more intensive, and the selection process continued to evolve. Throughout the 1980s, Delta Force conducted operations across the globe, most of which remain unknown to the public. They operated in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, often working alongside the CIA in missions that blurred the lines between military action and intelligence operations. They became the government's go-to solution for problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means and couldn't be solved without leaving American fingerprints all over the outcome. The unit's culture developed during this period into something truly unique within the American military. Delta operators wore civilian clothes and grew beards and long hair, better to blend into environments where military buzzkits would attract unwanted attention. They were given unusual latitude in selecting their own equipment, leading to an eclectic mix of weapons and gear that reflected individual preferences rather than standardized military issue. Rank mattered less than competence, and junior operators were expected to voice disagreement with more senior colleagues if they had valid tactical concerns. This culture of individual excellence and adaptive thinking would prove essential as the nature of American military operations evolved. The Cold War's end brought new challenges and new theaters. Delta Force operators deployed to Somalia in 1993, where they participated in the Battle of Mogadishu. Made famous by the book and film Black Hawk Down, they operated in the Balkans, in Africa, and throughout the Middle East as terrorism increasingly became the primary focus of American security concerns. Then came September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans transformed Delta Force's role fundamentally. Suddenly, the unit that had been created to respond to terrorism found itself at the spearhead of the largest counter-terrorism campaign in human history. Delta operators were among the first Americans into Afghanistan, working with CIA officers and local anti-Taliban forces to overthrow the regime that had sheltered al-Qaeda. The Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001 exemplified both Delta Force's capabilities and the frustrations of hunting high-value targets. Operators tracked Osama bin Laden to the mountainous cave complexes near the Pakistani border, engaging al-Qaeda fighters in brutal close-quarters combat. But decisions made far above their pay grade, the reliance on Afghan proxies, and the refusal to commit larger American ground forces allowed bin Laden to escape into Pakistan, where he would remain hidden for nearly another decade. That escape haunted Delta Force operators. They had been within striking distance of the man responsible for the worst terrorist attack in American history, and he had slipped through their fingers. When the opportunity finally came to finish the job, it would go to their sister unit, SEAL Team 6, who conducted the raid on bin Laden's Abbottabad compound in May 2011, but Delta Force's war was far from over. As the conflict in Iraq intensified, Delta operators found themselves at the center of a grinding campaign against insurgent networks and terrorist organizations. They conducted raids nearly every night, developing intelligence and then acting on it with devastating speed. They captured and killed hundreds of high-value targets, dismantling al-Qaeda in Iraq even as new threats like the Islamic State emerged. The Syria and Iraq campaign against ISIS saw Delta Force at its most active and most lethal. Operators conducted hundreds of missions, often crossing into Syrian territory to capture or kill Islamic State leadership. The 2015 raid that killed Abu Sayyaf, a senior ISIS leader, provided intelligence that transformed American understanding of the group's operations. Through all of this, Delta Force remained in the shadows. The unit's existence was officially acknowledged by the Pentagon only in the vaguest terms, and individual operators remained anonymous. Their families often didn't know the details of where they deployed or what they did. The unit's mystique grew with every operation that never made the news, every target neutralized without public acknowledgement. And it was this unit, this accumulation of 4 decades of institutional knowledge, operational experience, and refined lethality that would be tasked with what many considered the most politically explosive mission in American history. Because by 2025, the situation in Venezuela had deteriorated to the point where diplomatic options had been exhausted, and the decision had been made at the highest levels of the American government that Nicolas Maduro's regime represented an intolerable threat to hemispheric stability. The humanitarian crisis had displaced millions, destabilizing neighboring countries and creating security concerns that extended far beyond Venezuela's borders. Intelligence indicated that Maduro's government was providing sanctuary and support to drug trafficking organizations with direct connections to American violence. And persistent reports of Russian and Chinese military cooperation with the regime raised the specter of hostile foreign powers establishing permanent footholds in America's backyard. The previous approaches had failed. Sanctions had hurt the Venezuelan people more than the regime's inner circle, who maintained their luxurious lifestyles through corruption and black market connections. Diplomatic pressure had been brushed aside by a government that no longer cared about international legitimacy. Support for opposition forces had proven ineffective, as Maduro's security services ruthlessly suppressed any organized resistance. Even the massive bounty that the United States had placed on Maduro's head, offering $15 million for information leading to his arrest, had produced nothing actionable. But what intelligence could not buy, Delta Force might take. The planning for what would become known internally as Operation Caracas Endgame began not in a military facility, but in the sterile conference rooms of the intelligence community. CIA analysts had been building profiles on Maduro's security apparatus for years, cataloging every bodyguard, every safe house, every pattern of movement that might provide an operational window. The National Security Agency had devoted significant signals intelligence resources to penetrating Venezuelan communications, building a picture of the regime's internal dynamics that was remarkably detailed. But intelligence alone doesn't capture a dictator. For that, you need boots on the ground, and the boots in question would belong to operators from B Squadron, one of Delta Force's assault squadrons that had recently returned from a deployment in an undisclosed Middle Eastern location. These were men who had spent the better part of 2 decades conducting precisely this type of mission, infiltrating hostile territory, locating high-value targets, and either capturing or killing them with surgical precision. The mission would be extraordinarily complex, even by Delta Force standards. Unlike operations in Iraq or Syria, where American forces maintained a significant presence and could rely on supporting infrastructure, the Caracas mission would require the team to operate without any safety net whatsoever. There would be no quick reaction force standing by to bail them out if things went wrong. There would be no air support, no artillery, no backup. The operators would be alone in a hostile capital of 6 million people, surrounded by security forces that outnumbered them by approximately 50,000 to 1. To understand why this mission was even being considered, you need to understand just how bad things had gotten in Venezuela, and how Nicolas Maduro had managed to maintain his grip on power despite overseeing one of the most spectacular national collapses in modern history. Maduro had never been destined for leadership. He began his career as a bus driver in Caracas, a working-class kid from a leftist family who became involved in union politics during the turbulent 1980s. He was drawn to the socialist ideology that was gaining traction across Latin America, and when Hugo Chavez burst onto the Venezuelan political scene with his failed 1992 coup attempt, Maduro became an enthusiastic supporter. Chavez's eventual electoral victory in 1998 brought Maduro into the corridors of power. He served in various positions, including as foreign minister, developing relationships with Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran that would later prove essential to the regime's survival. When Chavez designated Maduro as his preferred successor shortly before dying of cancer in 2013, it surprised many who had expected more charismatic figures to inherit the Bolivarian revolution. What Maduro lacked in charisma, however, he made up for in cunning and ruthlessness. He understood that his survival depended on maintaining the loyalty of key power centers, the military, the intelligence services, and the colectivos, the armed civilian groups that served as the regime's street-level enforcers. He enriched generals with access to lucrative corruption schemes. He gave intelligence officials impunity to suppress opposition movements with whatever methods they deemed necessary. He armed the colectivos and unleashed them against protesters. The results were predictable and horrifying. Venezuela's economy, already damaged by Chavez's mismanagement, completely collapsed under Maduro. Hyperinflation rendered the currency worthless. Basic goods disappeared from store shelves. The healthcare system, once one of the best in Latin America, disintegrated entirely. Diseases that had been eradicated decades earlier returned with a vengeance. Malnutrition became widespread, with the average Venezuelan losing over 20 pounds of body weight as food became increasingly scarce. The humanitarian crisis was staggering in its scale. By 2025, over 7 million Venezuelans had fled the country, one of the largest displacement crises in the world. They poured across borders into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and beyond, straining the resources of host countries and creating political tensions throughout the region. Those who remained faced rolling blackouts, water shortages, and the constant threat of violence from both criminal gangs and government forces. Through all of this, Maduro remained in power. He stole elections with such brazen fraud that the international community simply stopped recognizing the results. He arrested opposition leaders and threw them in prison on fabricated charges. He ordered security forces to fire on protesters, killing hundreds. And when the pressure became too intense, he simply retreated behind his wall of security and waited for the international community's attention to shift elsewhere. That wall of security was formidable. Maduro's protective detail was built on overlapping layers of defense, each designed to compensate for potential weaknesses in the others. The innermost ring consisted of Cuban-trained bodyguards, men whose entire careers and families were bound to the regime. They never left Maduro's side, and they operated with standing orders to kill anyone who approached without authorization. Beyond this personal protection unit was a broader security apparatus that included elements of the Military Intelligence Service, the SEBIN, and the Bolivarian National Guard. These forces controlled access to any location where Maduro might be present, establishing perimeters that extended for blocks in every direction. They employed electronic countermeasures to defeat surveillance and maintained counter-sniper teams on surrounding rooftops. But perhaps most concerning from an operational perspective were the foreign advisors. Cuba had deployed intelligence and security personnel to Venezuela for years, and these experienced operators had helped design many of the protocols protecting Maduro. More recently, Russian private military contractors had appeared in Caracas, bringing with them expertise in countering exactly the kind of special operations strike that American planners were contemplating. The Delta Force planners studied all of this with painstaking care. They reviewed thousands of intelligence reports, satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and human source reporting. They built three-dimensional models of Caracas neighborhoods and potential target locations. They rehearsed scenarios in specially constructed mock-ups at classified training facilities. The challenge was finding an opportunity, a moment when Maduro would be accessible, when the layers of protection would be thin enough to penetrate. For months, no such opportunity presented itself. Maduro's unpredictability, his habit of constantly changing locations and plans, made targeting nearly impossible. The very paranoia that made him a terrible administrator made him an extremely difficult target. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a mid-level official in Maduro's own security apparatus who had grown disgusted with the regime's corruption and brutality. This source, whose identity remains classified to this day, provided something invaluable. Information about a planned meeting at a facility outside central Caracas, a location where Maduro would be present for several hours, where his security footprint would be lighter than usual, and where the operational geometry might actually favor an assault team. The meeting was scheduled to occur at a private estate in the hills south of the city, owned by a businessman closely connected to the regime's inner circle. Maduro would be traveling there to discuss certain financial arrangements with representatives of foreign governments who were helping the regime evade sanctions. The security would be significant, but crucially not impenetrable. The location's relative isolation, which Maduro believed made it safer, actually provided advantages for a small, highly skilled assault team. The planning accelerated dramatically once this intelligence was confirmed. Delta Force operators began intensive preparation, studying every available detail about the target location. They learned the terrain, the approach routes, the positions where guards would likely be stationed. They rehearsed the assault dozens of times, refining their tactics based on lessons learned from previous operations. The mission architecture that emerged was elegantly simple in concept, but devilishly complex in execution. The assault element would consist of approximately 24 operators divided into multiple teams with specific responsibilities. An assault team would be responsible for the actual capture of Maduro. Support teams would neutralize external security and hold the perimeter. A small sniper element would provide overwatch and take out any threats beyond the immediate engagement area. Insertion presented its own challenges. The team couldn't simply fly helicopters into Venezuelan airspace. The country's air defense network, upgraded with Russian assistance, would detect and engage any such approach. Instead, the operators would infiltrate by ground, crossing the border from Colombia through some of the most rugged and dangerous terrain in South America. The route would take them through areas controlled by various armed groups, FARC dissidents, drug trafficking organizations, and Venezuelan military units conducting border patrols. Any encounter with these forces could compromise the mission before it even began. The operators would need to move through this environment like shadows, leaving no trace of their passage. Once inside Venezuela, the team would make their way to a staging area approximately 10 kilometers from the target location. There, they would receive final intelligence updates, confirm that the operation was still viable, and prepare for the assault. The timing was critical. They needed to strike when Maduro was confirmed to be on site, but before the meeting concluded and he departed for another unknown location. The exfiltration plan was equally complex. Once Maduro was secured, the team would need to extract him and themselves from Venezuelan territory before the full weight of the security apparatus could respond. This would involve a carefully choreographed sequence of vehicle movements to a pre-designated extraction point, where helicopters launched from international waters would retrieve the team. The entire operation, from the moment the assault commenced to the moment the helicopters lifted off, needed to be completed in less than 90 minutes. Any longer, and the responding security forces would make escape impossible. As the planning neared completion, the mission received final authorization from the highest levels of the American government. The legal framework was carefully constructed based on the indictment that had been issued against Maduro for narco-terrorism charges and the substantial rewards offered for his apprehension. This wasn't technically an assassination mission or a coup attempt. It was, in the careful language of the lawyers, an arrest operation conducted against an indicted criminal who happened to occupy a governmental position. The diplomatic implications were staggering. No American president had ever ordered the forcible extraction of a sitting head of state. The precedent this would set was enormous, and the potential for escalation was significant. Russia and China, both heavily invested in Maduro's survival, would react forcefully? Latin American governments, even those that despised Maduro, would be forced to condemn what would appear to many as a flagrant violation of sovereignty, but the decision had been made. The potential benefits of removing Maduro, the stabilization of Venezuela, the disruption of drug trafficking networks, the elimination of a hostile regime in the Western Hemisphere were judged to outweigh the risks. Delta Force was given the green light. The operators began their infiltration 3 days before the planned assault. They crossed into Venezuela in small groups, moving at night and hiding during daylight hours. Each operator carried enough supplies for the entire mission, knowing that there would be no resupply and no support once they crossed the border. Their weapons were sanitized, impossible to trace back to American military stockpiles. Their communications equipment was encrypted with systems that would automatically destroy all data if tampered with. The movement to the staging area was uneventful but exhausting. The terrain was brutal, dense jungle giving way to steep mountain slopes that sapped energy and tested even the extraordinary conditioning of Delta Force operators. They avoided all human contact, detouring around villages and patrol routes identified through intelligence preparation. On the night of the second day, the assault team reached the staging area, a concealed position in the hills overlooking the target estate. From here, they could observe the preparations at the objective, confirming that the intelligence was accurate and identifying any last-minute changes to the security posture. What they saw was both encouraging and concerning. The estate matched the intelligence reporting precisely. Security personnel were visible at expected positions. Vehicles consistent with VIP movement were staged near the main building. All indicators suggested that the meeting was proceeding as planned, but the security presence was heavier than anticipated. Additional vehicles had arrived throughout the day, and observers counted more guards than expected. Either Maduro was traveling with an enhanced protection detail, or the meeting included other high-value individuals who had brought their own security. The team leader, a veteran operator with over 15 years in the unit, faced a critical decision. The mission had been planned against certain assumptions about enemy strength and disposition. Those assumptions now appeared to be incorrect. Proceeding risked higher casualties and potential mission failure. Aborting meant losing an opportunity that might never present itself again. This was exactly the situation that Delta Force training prepared operators to handle. The team leader consulted with his senior operators, quickly gathering input from the men who would be doing the fighting. They assessed the implications of the increased security presence, identified adjustments to the plan that could compensate, and reached a consensus. They would proceed. The assault was scheduled for the early morning hours, the time when human alertness is at its lowest and security forces would be least prepared for rapid action. Throughout the final day, the team rested and made final preparations. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Communications protocols were confirmed. Each operator reviewed his specific responsibilities until the sequence of actions was automatic. As darkness fell on the night of the operation, the team began its final approach to the objective. They moved in complete silence, using night vision equipment to navigate the terrain and identify potential threats. The temperature had dropped, and a light rain began falling, providing additional concealment for their movement. At 2300 hours, the team was in position. The assault element was staged less than 200 meters from the main building, concealed in vegetation that would be their last cover before the attack. The support elements had fanned out to positions that would allow them to interdict any reinforcements attempting to reach the compound. The snipers had established hides with clear lines of sight to the primary security positions. Everything was in place. All that remained was the confirmation that Maduro was actually inside the building. That confirmation came at 23:42 hours, when a communications intercept detected a call from Maduro's satellite phone. Voice analysis confirmed his identity. The target was present. The team leader spoke 2 words into his radio, words that initiated a cascade of violence that would reshape hemispheric politics. Execute. Execute. What happened next would last less than 4 minutes, but would be studied by military academies for generations. The snipers fired first, their suppressed rifles dropping for exterior guards simultaneously. The men crumpled where they stood, dead before they even registered that something was wrong. The synchronized elimination of the outer security layer was the signal for the assault element to move. 12 operators sprinted toward the main building in a formation designed to maximize speed while maintaining fields of fire. They reached the entrance in seconds, the point man already preparing the breaching charge that would blow the reinforced door off its hinges. The explosion was thunderous in the night silence. Before the debris had finished falling, the first operators were through the door, their weapons sweeping for threats. 2 guards in the foyer died immediately, their reactions far too slow to engage the shadows that flowed through the breach. The assault team split according to plan, one element moving toward the main meeting room while another secured the ground floor and prevented any organized resistance from forming. The speed was overwhelming. Guards who should have had time to react, to radio for help, to mount some kind of defense, found themselves facing operators who moved faster than their training had prepared them for. In the meeting room, chaos had erupted at the sound of the explosion. Maduro's personal bodyguards were already moving to cover him, their training overriding any instinct toward panic. But they had been prepared for certain types of threats: car bombs, sniper attacks, mob violence. They had not been prepared for a team of Delta Force operators breaching the building with the kind of precise violence that left no time for response. The first bodyguard to raise his weapon died with 3 rounds center mass before his finger could touch the trigger. The second managed to fire a single shot, which went wide before he too was eliminated. The operators flowed into the room like water, their weapons engaging threats with the mechanical precision that comes from thousands of hours of training. Nicolas Maduro, president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, found himself facing the muzzles of multiple rifles held by men whose faces were obscured by night vision devices and whose manner suggested they would not hesitate to fire. "Do not move. You are under arrest by order of the United States government." The words were spoken in Spanish, one of several languages that Delta Force operators routinely trained in. Maduro, to his credit, did not panic. He understood immediately what was happening, and he understood that resistance would result in his immediate death. He raised his hands. Outside, the support elements were engaging responding security forces. Vehicles attempting to approach the compound were disabled by precisely placed rifle fire that shredded their engines and tires. Guards who emerged from nearby buildings were engaged before they could establish firing positions. The snipers provided overwatch, their elevated positions allowing them to identify and neutralize threats that the ground elements couldn't see. The entire assault, from the initial sniper shots to the moment Maduro's hands were flex-cuffed behind his back, lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. But capturing Maduro was only half the mission. Now came the part that every operator knew would be the most dangerous: the exfiltration. The moment the assault began, a clock had started counting down. Venezuelan security forces would be responding, military units would be mobilizing. Within minutes, every road out of the area would be swarming with soldiers and police desperately trying to locate their missing president. The team had a narrow window to disappear before that net closed around them. The operators moved with practiced efficiency. Maduro was surrounded by a protective cordon of assaulters, not to protect him from harm, but to ensure he couldn't escape or be rescued. His hands remained bound, and a hood had been placed over his head to disorient him and prevent him from identifying landmarks that might help any future rescue attempt. The team exited the compound through a rear access point that had been identified during the planning phase. 3 vehicles were waiting, driven by operators who had infiltrated separately and positioned themselves for exactly this moment. The convoy moved out in tight formation, headlights off, drivers navigating using night vision equipment. Behind them, the compound was a scene of carnage and confusion. Bodies of guards lay where they had fallen. Surviving personnel were only beginning to process what had happened, their training completely inadequate for a situation where the president had simply vanished into the night. It would be several more minutes before anyone thought to radio a coherent report to higher authorities. Those minutes were precious. The convoy navigated through secondary roads that wound through the hills south of Caracas. These routes had been selected precisely because they avoided major checkpoints and military installations. The intelligence preparation for the mission had included exhaustive analysis of Venezuelan security force patterns, identifying gaps in coverage that could be exploited. 10 minutes into the extraction, the first radio intercepts indicated that Venezuelan forces were beginning to react. Frantic communications between security officials revealed the growing panic as the scope of the attack became clear. The president was missing, multiple guards were dead, and the attackers had vanished without a trace. The Venezuelan response was swift but disorganized. Commanders issued conflicting orders. Units that should have established blocking positions instead rushed toward the compound, hoping to catch the attackers there. The confusion bought the Delta team additional time they used to put miles between themselves and the last known location. But the advantage couldn't last forever. As the convoy approached the first major highway crossing, the lead vehicle reported activity ahead. Venezuelan military vehicles were establishing a checkpoint, their movements hasty but their intention clear: seal the roads and trap whoever had taken the president. The team leader made a rapid assessment. The checkpoint was still being established. The soldiers were focused on setting up their positions rather than actively searching vehicles. There might be a narrow window to pass through before the checkpoint became fully operational. The decision was made in seconds. The convoy accelerated. What followed was a moment of extraordinary tension. 3 unmarked vehicles carrying America's most wanted target and the operators who had captured him approached a Venezuelan military checkpoint at high speed. If the soldiers reacted, if they opened fire or attempted to block the road, the entire mission could end in a catastrophic firefight. The lead driver held his nerve perfectly. He didn't slow down or speed up, maintaining a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than flight. The soldiers, still organizing their equipment and not yet fully alert, barely glanced at the passing vehicles. By the time anyone thought to question the convoy, it had disappeared into the darkness beyond. It was the closest call of the entire operation. In debriefings afterward, operators would describe that moment as the point where they truly believed they might not make it out. But they were through. The road ahead was clear, at least for now. The extraction point was a remote clearing approximately 30 kilometers from the Colombian border. It had been selected for its isolation and its suitability for helicopter operations. As the convoy approached, operators in the lead vehicle scanned for any signs that the location had been compromised. They saw nothing. The clearing was empty, dark, silent. The vehicles were abandoned and disabled, their tires slashed and engines destroyed to prevent any forensic recovery of useful intelligence. The team moved into the clearing on foot, establishing a defensive perimeter while the communications specialist made contact with the extraction helicopters. The wait that followed was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire mission. The operators had done everything right. They had infiltrated undetected, executed the assault with textbook precision, and evaded the initial response. But now they were stationary, vulnerable, dependent on assets that were still minutes away. Every sound in the jungle around them was potentially hostile. Every rustle in the vegetation could be a Venezuelan patrol that had somehow tracked them. The operators, despite their exhaustion and the massive adrenaline dump of the assault, remained at peak alertness. They had not come this far to fail at the last moment. At 0117 hours, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors became audible to the south. 2 NH-60 Black Hawks, modified for special operations and flown by pilots from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, were inbound. These aircraft had launched from a naval vessel positioned in international waters, carefully timed to arrive at the extraction point within the mission's window. The helicopters touched down in the clearing, their rotor wash flattening the surrounding vegetation. The operators moved quickly, loading Maduro into one aircraft while the team split between both helicopters. Within 60 seconds, both aircraft were airborne, climbing rapidly and turning south toward the border. Venezuelan airspace was technically hostile, but the helicopters flew low and fast, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection. The flight to international waters took just under 40 minutes during which every operator remained alert for the possibility of interception. But no Venezuelan aircraft appeared. The regime's air force, caught completely off guard by the operation, had failed to mount any response. At 0-0-3 hours, the helicopters crossed into international airspace and began their approach to the USS Bataan, an amphibious assault ship that had been positioned to receive them. As the aircraft touched down on the deck, the mission was officially complete. Nicolas Maduro, indicted narco-terrorist and authoritarian dictator, was in American custody. The international response was precisely as chaotic as planners had anticipated. Russia denounced the operation in the strongest possible terms, calling it an act of piracy and demanding Maduro's immediate release. China expressed grave concern and warned of consequences for what it termed American imperialism. Cuba, whose intelligence services had failed to prevent the capture of their most important ally, went into a diplomatic frenzy, but the reaction that mattered most came from within Venezuela itself. When dawn broke over Caracas and the news of Maduro's capture became public, the response was not what many had expected. There were no massive protests demanding his return. There was no spontaneous uprising of regime loyalists. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like relief. Years of suffering had exhausted any genuine popular support for Maduro. Those who had remained loyal to the regime had done so out of fear or self-interest, not conviction. With Maduro gone, with the man who had ordered the murders and the torture and the starvation suddenly no longer present, that fear evaporated. The apparatus of repression, without its unifying figure, began to fragment. Within days, senior military officers were negotiating with opposition leaders. The intelligence services, realizing that their survival depended on cooperation with whatever came next, began releasing political prisoners. The colectivos, facing a future without their patron, melted back into the barrios from which they had come. It was not a smooth transition. Power vacuums never are. Competing factions jockeyed for position. Old scores were settled, sometimes violently. The humanitarian crisis continued, its underlying causes not immediately solvable regardless of who held political power, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in years, Venezuelans could imagine a future that might be different from the endless nightmare of Maduro's rule. International aid began flowing into the country. Exiles began returning. The machinery of reconstruction, slow and imperfect, began to grind into motion. And in a federal courthouse in Miami, Nicolas Maduro faced the charges that had been filed against him years earlier. The trial would be lengthy and controversial. Defense attorneys argued that his capture was illegal, that the United States had violated international law and basic principles of sovereignty. Prosecutors countered that the charges were legitimate, the evidence overwhelming, and that Maduro had forfeited any claim to sovereign immunity through his criminal conduct. The legal arguments would continue for years, but the political reality was already established. Maduro would never return to Venezuela. The regime he had built was gone. The Bolivarian Revolution, for better or worse, was over. For the operators of Delta Force, the mission's success brought no public recognition. There were no parades, no medals on display, no interviews with grateful officials. The men who had executed one of the most audacious special operations in American history returned to their units and prepared for the next mission. Their names remained classified, their accomplishments remained secret. This anonymity was not a burden, but a choice fundamental to the unit's culture and essential to its effectiveness. Delta Force operators understand that their work cannot survive public scrutiny. The methods they employ, the risks they take, the moral complexities they navigate all exist in a space that the public has agreed not to examine too closely. In the weeks following the Caracas operation, there were quiet acknowledgments within the special operations community. Unit commanders who understood what had been accomplished expressed their respect in the understated manner that such professionals favor. There were no celebrations, but there was recognition, and there were lessons to be absorbed. The operation would be studied intensively, its successes and near failures analyzed for insights that might prove valuable in future missions. The moment at the checkpoint, when the convoy had passed within feet of Venezuelan soldiers who could have ended the mission with a single burst of gunfire, would be examined from every angle. How had the drivers maintained their composure? What factors had contributed to the soldiers' failure to react? Could the same technique be employed again, or had it succeeded only through luck? These questions matter because Delta Force's work is never finished. As long as there are threats that conventional forces cannot address, as long as there are hostages to be rescued and terrorists to be neutralized and dictators to be brought to justice, there will be a need for the capabilities that Delta Force represents. The unit that Charlie Beckwith built from his frustration and vision has evolved far beyond what he might have imagined. The operators of today train with technologies that didn't exist when the first selection class assembled at Fort Bragg. They face threats that Beckwith never anticipated, from sophisticated terrorist networks to hostile nation-states deploying advanced electronic warfare capabilities. But the fundamental elements remain unchanged. The selection process still breaks most who attempt it, identifying the rare individuals who possess the physical capability, psychological resilience, and adaptive intelligence that the mission requires. The training still emphasizes individual judgment and small unit excellence over rigid adherence to doctrine. The culture still values competence over rank, results over process, and the missions still demand everything that operators can give. Every deployment carries the possibility of death or capture, of outcomes that could embarrass the nation or trigger international crises. The operators accept these risks because they believe in the importance of what they do, because they have committed themselves to a calling that most people cannot understand. The Caracas operation represented something of a culmination for the unit, a demonstration that the capabilities developed over for decades could be applied to challenges that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Capturing a sitting head of state from his own capital, extracting him across hostile territory, and delivering him to face justice was a mission that pushed every boundary of what special operations could achieve. But it also raised questions that have no easy answers. The precedent established by the operation is troubling to many, even those who celebrated Maduro's removal. If the United States can arrest a head of state when it deems that leader sufficiently criminal, what limits exist on American power? Who makes the determination of which leaders are legitimate and which are subject to forcible removal? These are questions that will be debated by scholars and diplomats for generations. For the operators themselves, such questions are largely abstract. Their job is not to make policy, but to execute it, to solve the problems that political leaders have decided require solving. When the order comes, they respond. The moral weight of those orders falls on those who give them, not on those who carry them out. Or so the theory goes. In practice, the psychological burden of these operations is not so easily transferred. Operators who have killed at close range, who have seen the life leave the eyes of their targets, carry those experiences with them. The training helps, providing psychological tools and organizational support for processing the inevitable trauma. But it doesn't eliminate it. Many operators struggle with the transition to civilian life when their service ends. The skills that make them extraordinarily effective in combat have limited application in peacetime society. The intensity of the operational environment creates bonds between operators that civilian friendships rarely match. Some struggle with alcohol, with relationships, with the ordinary challenges of a life that seems colorless compared to what they've experienced. Others find ways to channel their abilities into productive civilian careers. They become security consultants, law enforcement trainers, private military contractors who continue to serve in various capacities. They write books, though carefully vetted to protect classified information. They mentor the next generation, passing on lessons that no training program can fully capture. The unit itself continues, perpetually preparing for the next mission even as it absorbs the lessons of the last one. New operators complete selection and begin the years-long process of developing the skills that might one day be required. Veterans rotate out, their places taken by younger men who have their own wars to fight. The nature of those wars continues to evolve. The terrorism-focused operations that dominated the post-9/11 era are giving way to new challenges. Great power competition with China and Russia, the persistent threat of rogue states like North Korea and Iran, the emerging dangers of cyber warfare and artificial intelligence. Delta Force must adapt to each new threat environment while maintaining the core competencies that have always defined the unit. The Caracas operation demonstrated that adaptation in action. The mission combined classic direct action techniques developed over decades with new technologies and intelligence capabilities that would have been unimaginable to the unit's founders. Satellite communications, real-time drone surveillance, advanced encryption, and biometric identification all played roles in the operation's success. But in the end, it still came down to trained operators moving through darkness, making split-second decisions, and trusting each other with their lives. That trust, perhaps more than any technology or technique, is what makes Delta Force effective. The selection process identifies individuals who can be trusted absolutely, who will not fail their teammates regardless of circumstances. The training builds bonds that transcend ordinary professional relationships. The operations themselves forge those bonds into something unbreakable. In the years following Caracas, the unit would face new challenges and conduct new operations, most of which will remain classified for decades. The war against terrorism continues in various forms across multiple continents. The great power competition intensifies with potential flashpoints in Taiwan, the Baltic states, and beyond. The demand for Delta Force's capabilities shows no sign of diminishing, and somewhere, in a training facility that doesn't officially exist, the next generation of operators is preparing for missions that haven't yet been conceived. They run endless drills. They shoot thousands of rounds. They push their bodies to limits that would break ordinary men. They study languages, cultures, and operational techniques. They absorb the hard-won lessons of those who came before them. They become the invisible warriors that the nation needs but cannot acknowledge. They embrace a life of sacrifice and secrecy, knowing that their greatest achievements will never be publicly celebrated. They understand that their names will remain unknown, their operations classified, their contributions invisible to the citizens they protect. This is the legacy of Delta Force, from Charlie Beckwith's frustrated vision in the jungles of Vietnam, through the tragedy of Desert One and the countless operations that followed, to the streets of Caracas on the night when a dictator was brought to justice. The unit has embodied a particular American capability. The ability to project precise, devastating power anywhere on Earth to solve problems that cannot be solved through diplomacy or conventional force. It is a capability that carries tremendous responsibility. The power to reach anywhere and do anything is also the power to make terrible mistakes, to cause harm rather than good, to create crises rather than resolve them. The operators and their commanders understand this. The weight of that understanding shapes every decision, every operation, every moment. In the end, Delta Force exists because the world is a dangerous and complicated place, and because some problems require solutions that exist beyond the boundaries of ordinary military or law enforcement action. The men who serve in the unit have accepted a burden that most cannot imagine, and they carry it in silence. When Nicolas Maduro stood before an American judge to face the charges against him, he represented something more than a defeated dictator answering for his crimes. He represented proof that no one is beyond the reach of American power when that power is wielded by the most capable operators on Earth. The prison cell that awaits him will be his final destination. The end of a journey that began with revolutionary dreams and ended in corruption, brutality, and ultimately accountability. The Delta Force operators who made that accountability possible have already moved on, their attention focused on the next mission, the next target, the next impossible task that their nation requires them to accomplish. They remain in the shadows, where they have always been and where they will always be. Ready, waiting, preparing for whatever comes next. Because in a world full of threats that respect no borders and acknowledge no rules, someone has to be the response that those threats never see coming. Someone has to be Delta Force.